So welcome to the lunchtime learning session, and today it's about the social and cultural context of breastfeeding. So I'm Eleanor. I work for Southend YMCA. As part of my job, I run a project called Bump to Breast, which provides breastfeeding support groups in the community, and yeah, we're funded by Better Start, which has been great. Been running for nearly 7 years. So I also do, we have volunteer training. So we've had various people who've taken part in that, people who've come along as parents and have then wanted to learn a bit more so that they can help others around them as well. So some of what I'm talking about today is similar to some of the things that are covered in the training. There'll be a few other bits as well. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of look at breastfeeding, not just from that kind of like health and medical side, but kind of that more kind of holistic, kind of set within a community, kind of people's relationships with their family and friends, all that kind of thing. So I think sometimes, especially breastfeeding sometimes kind of really falls under that kind of medical category, which while that's really important, as I'm sure lots of people are aware, there's a lot more to people's kind of breastfeeding journey and breastfeeding experience as well. So first of all, I was thinking about the UK in the context of the wider world. So in the UK, we do have one of the lowest breastfeeding rates in the world. It's kind of, we vie with Ireland for who's going to have the lowest breastfeeding rates. It's, a bit of a dubious honour. And this, seems to have stayed fairly low. We have got the kind of official statistics that were on the UNICEF website, which is from the UK-wide infant feeding survey. That's from quite a long time ago. That's from 2010. So that's the kind of most recent kind of large-scale statistics that we've got. But what UNICEF also told us is that out of 5 people in the UK who end up formula feeding their babies, 4 out of those 5 people, actually, that wasn't their plan. They wanted to breastfeed. It didn't work out and they stopped breastfeeding before they felt ready to do that. And this is largely due to a lack of support and people not being able to breastfeed as long as they want to for a whole variety of reasons, not feeling able to breastfeed out and about, and not being able to get the information about breastfeeding, and not having necessarily a supportive community around them. And when breastfeeding doesn't work out, people can really feel that sense of kind of grief and loss about it as well, because it's how they wanted to feed their baby. It's, it can be quite sad and difficult for people. Obviously, we don't want that. That's why we're here, with the breastfeeding support that we do in Southend, to try and make sure that if people do want to breastfeed, we're going to be there and they can have that support they need to do that. Obviously, for some people, that one person in 5, they wanted to formula feed. It fitted in with their family. We are lucky that we live in a country where got safe enough water and people can safely prepare alternative food for their babies if that's what they want to do. And often those people who did actively choose to formula feed are kind of, they're happy about that decision, and that's fine. So just going to give you some statistics about kind of breastfeeding rates in the UK, bearing in mind this is the infant feeding survey from 2010. So breastfeeding initiation was 81%. So quite a lot of people gave it a go in the beginning. Exclusive breastfeeding at 6 weeks, so just breast milk, was 24% in England. Exclusive breastfeeding at 3 months was 17%. Exclusive breastfeeding at 6 months, which is what the World Health Organization recommends, remained at around 1%. So that's really interesting, isn't it? So the World Health Organization recommends giving just breast milk till 6 months, and then breastfeeding until 2 years or beyond if both mother and baby are happy with it. And the rate of any breastfeeding at 6 weeks was 55%. While at 6 months it was 34%. So this is from the UNICEF website, and they're saying that this is since kind of the baby friendly, and those are higher than they had been, which they're saying it kind of coincided with the introduction of the baby friendly initiative, which is a accreditation scheme to encourage hospitals and community settings to become more breastfeeding friendly. So what's going on? While my thought is that in Southend, especially those kind of breastfeeding for longer, we kind of do get a sense. I'm sure those of you who also kind of work in breastfeeding support locally do get a sense that, you know, the figures might be quite a lot more than that, especially people who are feeding their older babies and toddlers. So it'd be interesting to see, you know, kind of when we're able to find out about that, what those statistics are about people breastfeeding their, you know, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And I did do a very quick and not very scientific poll on our Facebook groups. So it's people who joined that at Bump to Breast who were part of those Facebook groups. So wasn't everybody at all. And I asked people to comment if they were happy to do that. Obviously, not everybody would want to comment. Were they feeding a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old and 4-year-old? And I came up with 48 people who were doing that. So I thought that was really interesting. And obviously, you know, in that context of how many births we know happen in the Better Start areas, I thought, well, even that is showing that there's, you know, quite strong figures on that, and would hint that maybe if there was a bit more research into that, we might actually find that in Southend there are quite a lot of people feeding their older babies and toddlers, but we don't, you know, we don't have kind of official statistics on that at the moment. So a history of breastfeeding. Humans, obviously we're mammals, aren't we? Same as lots of other mammals. This, you know, being able to feed our young ourselves has evolved over millions of years, and it's a huge evolutionary advantage, isn't it? So any changes which like impacted on women's ability to breastfeed over all these thousands of years would have been selected out over the years, wouldn't they? Because it would have had a huge impact on baby survival. So probably there were some women thousands of years ago who, you know, found breastfeeding struggle, maybe didn't make quite enough milk, maybe their babies were struggling to breastfeed. However, as a community, probably it's likely that people fed each other's children, that people were there to support each other. And we are, as humans, designed to live in a social group and help each other out and share knowledge as well as share this care. And often this is kind of what we don't have so much with less extended family around us now. So I was thinking about a myth that my sister was told when she had her first child 20 years ago, and her it was her health visitor at the time, so I'm sure long retired now, had said to her, oh, you won't be able, you know, you're going to find breastfeeding painful. It's not a surprise you've got cracked nipples because you've got red hair and pale skin. And so she was told this by a health professional. And there's, you know, this myth that red-haired women can't breastfeed or are going to have trouble breastfeeding. However, you know, red hair's passed down genetically, isn't it? If there was something in red hair which made breastfeeding more difficult, you know, red hair would be gone a long time ago. And, you know, never mind all these kind of underlying assumptions about people with pale skin and pain. And it's like, you know, don't even want to go there. But, you know, really interesting to kind of hear, and we will kind of look at later in this talk, some of the myths that kind of persist over time. And sometimes, you know, that's, I have heard like from older women as well who had red hair and being told that, oh, I couldn't breastfeed because I had red hair. And then, you know, if there's breastfeeding pain, they're not kind of helped towards a solution for that. You know, thank goodness, don't hear that one anymore. We will come to some other interesting myths later on that people have told us about as well. So yeah, what about kind of cultural norms? And you know, in the past, we know from things like in the Old Testament, in the Bible, there's a story about the boy Samuel, who was he went to work as an apprentice at the temple when, like, after he'd been weaned. So that would have been maybe 3.5, 4 years old, something like that. And he went to work as a little assistant, and he didn't go there until he was weaned. So he was going straight from breastfeeding to work. Imagine it, just imagine it. But this was normal breastfeeding, and it, while you might hear comments about, well, in those days they didn't have a fridge. Well, no, in those days they didn't have a fridge, but that doesn't mean that the fridge is that kind of biological norm, does it? And the Quran suggests breastfeeding until the child is 2 years old, which is interesting, is in line with World Health Organization recommendations. So if people are able to breastfeed, then that's kind of in line with that suggestion. So what about the kind of baby food industry and alternative foods? Well, throughout history, people have given infants other foods. Sometimes another woman would feed the baby if the baby's own mother was unable to do this with wet nursing, whether that was just informally within the community, or whether it was a paid professional wet nurse. Particularly wealthy women might choose to do that. People fed their infants other mammals' milk, and sometimes archaeologists have found these little kind of spout bottles, which is in the shape of an animal with a little face on it, which is maybe that like kind of toddler's feeding bottle. And first of all, they couldn't work out what the purpose of it was, and when they analysed what was inside, they then found that it had been other mammals' milk. And I found evidence, they found evidence that it could have been, not just cow milk, could have been donkey milk, horse milk, camel milk, even pig milk, as well as sheep or goat. Because in those days, when people, were farmers and there was a lactating animal as part of their stock, then there'd be no reason not to use that milk if it was if they wanted to. And then people have also throughout history given babies kind of mixtures of things, called a flour and other ingredients, which may have been kind of given on a spoon. An interesting, a bit sad kind of observation is that sometimes these feeding vessels from a long time ago were found buried with the infants, and you think, well, you do wonder whether that kind of contributed to those infants sadly having a short life, because we don't know the story, but perhaps they weren't able to be given breast milk. We don't know. So how does think about the people who worked as wet nurses, who were able to breastfeed other people's children, and some people were paid as this, and they'd be a nurse as well, like a nursery nurse as well, to help look after that child. So the first commercial infant formula, which was called Liebig's formula, was invented in 1865. And I'm just going to look up for you what the ingredients are, because I'm not going to remember what all that is. So it says it was made from cow's milk, wheat and malt flour and potassium bicarbonate. And it was kind of marketed as a perfect food for babies. This was kind of at the same time as lots of that industrial revolution, factories, women going to work in the factories, that kind of real change, people living in more urban areas, and somebody else needing to look after the child. So that then led to various other companies, like, well, something's been invented, like often we see, and other companies started to invent their own infant formulas, and also different vessels to be able to feed the baby with, including kind of the development of that infant feeding bottle, which at the beginning, was often difficult to clean. People didn't even know about germ theory, did they? Back in those days, they didn't know that kind of the germs could breed if it was left on the side, and didn't know to keep the milk cool as well. So, but as that science developed, as people started to realise and understand that this was the reason why, some of these formula for babies were getting on well, they started to be able to put those practices in place, so that then reduced the kind of quite shocking infant mortality rates associated with artificial feeding. And over the years as well, the formula manufacturers started to realise that there were other vitamins, other minerals that was in breast milk that they'd try and put in. So, however, you can look at a list of ingredients on a container of formula, and it's have quite a long list of ingredients, and some of them might have similar name or the same name as something that's in breast milk, but it doesn't mean it's exactly the same, because the body obviously absorbs something from a human fluid that's made by a human, that is a live fluid. It's going to be absorbed very differently, and some of the live elements of breast milk can't be replicated, just because of the way that it's, you know, it's ready at source and it's there for the baby. And so that's quite interesting that, you know, those the formula companies, and we will talk about this a bit more later, they'll talk about all their breast milk research, that, you know, you can never replace a live fluid. And another little aside is that while you don't hear, you know, we don't really talk about breast is best, you know, breastfeeding's normal, formula feeding's useful, infant formulas useful. We want, you know, to breastfeeding just to, you know, be normal in the community. But that term breastfeeding is best, people seem to have heard it and feel this pressure from it. And it wasn't until, you know, maybe it was last year or something, and actually somebody pointed out to me that the place you see that phrase is on the formula tin, right? So I thought, oh, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of setting up, you know, breastfeeding as this like best thing that's maybe a bit unattainable, but we'll be your friend, we'll help you. Here's the formula. So this kind of is this kind of clever advertising, which you know, infant formula companies do use. Right. So then I was thinking a little bit about if the UK's got, you know, the lower breastfeeding rates than many other countries. Why is that? It's certainly not to do with women's bodies, is it? You know, I'm not going to say that like women's breasts are different from one country to the next, you know, and we can see this when we have immigrant communities coming from a country with a high breastfeeding rate. So people might move from a country which has a you know, quite strong breastfeeding rate. They move to the UK. That rate stays high for the first 3 or 4 years, which is really interesting. There's lots of this in Amy Brown's book if you want to look it up. And then over time, as people assimilate, so I'm sure it kind of depends on the person and depends on their kind of support network and community, that breastfeeding rate then drops in line with kind of UK rates. So it's been quite interesting at Bump to Breast. We have, you know, really lovely mixture of people speaking lots of different languages and coming together, and people, you know, who's maybe have previously lived in a country with a high breastfeeding rate, which I think has really helped to kind of generally increase people's confidence in Southend about breastfeeding. So in a way, that's kind of had a really positive effect. And I think that kind of I'd like to hope and think that that's kind of mitigated some of that factor of that, you know, breastfeeding rates dropping with time, which kind of does happen if there isn't, you know, isn't support. So that really shows that those, you know, the low breastfeeding rates in the UK is not to be blamed on individual women or families. It's not about that person. You know, sometimes people feel that they've been told they haven't tried hard enough, or why didn't they breastfeed? It's not to do with that. And it's not to do with women's bodies. It's not to do with families. It's due to those circumstances. So now I'm coming on to the breastfeeding myths. So you can always add in the discussion later, or maybe put in the chat if you want to, if you've come up with any other interesting ones, because these are quite, yeah, these are all ones we had. So women in my family can't breastfeed. So that's an interesting one. You know, my mum didn't breastfeed, my grandmother didn't breastfeed, therefore I'm not going to be able to breastfeed. Unlikely that it's going to be something genetic that's been passed down, because we said before, you know, it's very important to kind of human and infant survival for, you know, if there's anything that prevented breastfeeding, that would have been deselected a long time ago. You know, very small chance there might be, but unlikely. It's more likely that maybe the grandmother was told to breastfeed every 4 hours and the baby didn't feed as often as really they needed to. Milk supply dropped, and then that advice was passed on. So it could be passed on, but kind of not genetically as such. Another one, it's not natural to feed a baby over 6 months or 1 year or whatever. It's not natural, it's not normal, and it's not natural. Well, you know, normal, what's normal, but natural, certainly yes, because, you know, within other places in the world, other times in history, looking at other mammals, absolutely, it is natural to feed older babies and toddlers as well. Another myth: breastfeeding is always or never painful, right? So you kind of get both ways. So somebody was saying the other day they've been told by their mum, oh, breastfeeding, it just hurts, you just have to get on with it. And that can be really difficult, can't it? Because there's always something you can do. There's in terms of, might take a bit of time and patience, help with that positioning and attachments, to help with that pain. And sometimes that can be a sign that something's not right and something needs to change. Breastfeeding is never painful, or should, if it hurts, you're doing it wrong. I think sometimes this can go the other way as well, because sometimes at the beginning of breastfeeding can be quite uncomfortable, sometimes not quite, doesn't quite get it. And it's new, isn't it? The baby's learning, mum's learning, the skin's not used to this. You might, the skin can react to various things. And then to sometimes people to feel that kind of weight of that they're doing something wrong, if it hurts, can also be a bit just a little bit counterproductive as well. Sometimes, yes, sometimes breastfeeding can be painful. There's things we can do to help it be a bit better, but sometimes it can be painful. Right, you can't breastfeed on that medicine, can't drink alcohol. So as I'm sure many of you have come across, there's the Drugs in Breast Milk Information Service, which is really helpful to be able to point people in that direction, to find out really good, accurate information from volunteer pharmacists who are mums themselves, who breastfed, who will be able to give information about, whether that medicine's okay for breastfeeding, and if there's alternatives. And very often there are. Can't drink alcohol. People sometimes are under the impression they can't drink any alcohol at all when breastfeeding, and maybe they've had a drink of fizz as a celebration and then think, oh my goodness, I can't feed, and then they stop feeding because they might think, oh no, I'm going to poison my baby. But actually, the body clears alcohol, the same as for driving, that alcohol level will drop in the body as well. So right, if you have mastitis, you need to stop breastfeeding. Somebody was telling me this morning that their mum had been told that when they were 3 months and had stopped breastfeeding. Now, actually, with mastitis, you need to carry on breastfeeding, but that information is not always there. Can be difficult. May need, antibiotics. May need thinking about the positioning and attachment, and there's other things you might need to do, but you don't need to stop breastfeeding. And actually, that could make it worse. Right. You need to get the baby used to a bottle. Came across this one, and it was with quite a young baby, and I had to chat with the person. I was saying, well, if you've got something on, you're going out for something special, you're going back to work early, and none of those things were happening. But this person was thinking they needed to get the baby used to a bottle and to get a really big stash in the freezer, but they hadn't got any plans for about 3 or 4 months that they were actually going to leave their baby. There's just this kind of impression that they had that, but that can put an additional pressure on people, because they don't have to get the baby used to a bottle. By the time you're leaving them, they might be ready for a little cup. By the time you need to leave them, they might have that bottle. By the time you're leaving them, they might be over 6 months, and they might be all right with some snacks and some sips of water out of a cup. Right, come on, notes. There we are. Right, what else have we got? Dad can't bond if you are breastfeeding, okay? And well, lovely though it is to give our children food, there'll be plenty of opportunities for that. Dad can bond if you're breastfeeding. There's lots of ways for dad to bond: skin to skin cuddles, carry the baby in a sling, give the baby a bath, lots and lots, sing to the baby, read them stories, lots and lots of ways to do that. It is not essential for bonding with dad. Some people may want to express and give in a bottle, but it's certainly not something people need to feel pressured to do. Right, breastfeeding is tiring. A bottle will give you a break, okay? Parenting's tiring, however you're feeding your baby, parenting is pretty tiring, and a bottle won't necessarily give you a break. I think this is a myth around kind of breastfeeding versus formula feeding, that, formula feeding is going to be easier, formula feeding is going to give you a break. Not necessarily, especially over the kind of longer term, and it's the parenting that's tiring, not the feeding method. Right, if the baby's feeding all the time, that means you don't have enough milk. That's a very common perception and kind of sometimes I think when like formula feeding is seen as the norm, and has historically been seen there, there's instructions and kind of about how often that baby might need a bottle of formula and how much they might have in it. But breastfeeding, just kind of go with your baby. When they want to feed, they can feed. That's absolutely fine. Right, the baby will be clingy if you breastfeed. Yeah, still hear that one. Babies being clingy. Well, babies do like a cuddle, of course they do. It's great for their attachment. It's great for them to be responded to. And the science tells us that when our children are responded to, when they're held, when they got their needs met, then their attachment's great. And then they're going to be more confident later on and less anxious. Right, you can't feed a baby once they have teeth. You can see the logic. Somebody who's not had children can absolutely see the logic. How am I going to feed with, those teeth on my breast? However, the baby's tongue covers the bottom teeth. The top teeth might rest on the breast. So you absolutely can feed a baby when they've got teeth. And, the recommendation of feeding till 2 years and beyond, if both mum and baby are happy with it, most, children will have teeth by then. Sometimes when they're teething, babies clamp down on everything. Unfortunately, sometimes that might be you. However, often it is just a one-off, and when they realise that they don't do it again. If you're going back to work, you will need to stop breastfeeding, and some people won't even start. I've come across people who think, well, I'm going back to work, there's no point in me starting breastfeeding. However, UK law does support people breastfeeding at work. If you have low supply, you need to stop breastfeeding. That's an interesting one. And then people think, well, if I can only give them this much, I might as well not give them anything at all. But actually, any breast milk shows proven long-term benefits, which is absolutely amazing. So try and make sure that people know that whatever milk they've got, it's worth giving that to their babies, and it is all breastfeeding, which I think is another myth as well, that sometimes people think only that direct breastfeeding is breastfeeding. But I think that message, which I'm sure many of us are getting out there as well, is it's all breastfeeding. Breastfeeding ruins your figure. Well, pregnancy changes your figure, shall we say, and it's all relative as well, isn't it? Our figures and the passage of time and gravity change our figures. It's not the breastfeeding itself. So thinking about kind of family and community influence, often this is meant very kindly. People around us, aunties, grandparents, cousins, sisters, friends, the advice is meant kindly, but this is kind of often, there's not that much necessarily breastfeeding knowledge and experience in the community. So people will talk about their own experience and what worked for them, and they're just trying to fix things. And sometimes, when things are hard, you don't necessarily want somebody to come in with an answer. Right, do this thing, then it's fixed, then you're not upsetting more. Sometimes you just want somebody to listen and understand. So these comments like, if you're finding breastfeeding hard, don't worry, just give them a bottle. I did and they were fine. And this kind of does persist, and it seems to persist through generations, and it's meant kindly, but not always very helpful to the person who's really wanted to breastfeed and they want to make it work. Breastfeeding can be hard, formula feeding can be hard, parenting can be hard, not being a parent can be hard. Sometimes life's just a bit exhausting, and sometimes people don't know where to find support, and sometimes those grandparents, those aunties, older sisters may be experiencing their own breastfeeding grief and trauma, because when another baby comes into the family and they see that baby being breastfed, even if they're not intending to, they want to be supportive, but it reminds them of that time when they wanted to breastfeed and didn't have the support and it didn't work out and they were sad about it. So there is that kind of factor going on as well. Then you kind of think about breastfeeding in the media. So it's really interesting, isn't it? So often when breastfeeding is portrayed in the media, it's in like a bit of a negative way. Do occasionally get some good examples, not very often, either as kind of controversial, or there'll be some like extreme version, or portrayed as extreme of someone feeding a like much older child is portrayed as painful or difficult, rather than the normal as something to laugh about. So there is this kind of issue as well. And I think we do come across some like positive images of just breastfeeding being normal, but I think honestly we could do with a lot more of that on TV, in adverts. It's not a massive deal. This is how some babies eat. How many people physically can't breastfeed? Well, this is a really interesting question because in countries like Botswana have a really high breastfeeding rate, and 98% of babies are being breastfed at age 1. So that might kind of tie in with that 1 to 2% that's sometimes kind of quoted about how many people physically may not be able to breastfeed. Obviously, it depends on, how early babies are born. There's, lots and lots of other factors. However, apart from that, there's physical reasons which can happen as a result of the circumstances, especially in those early days of breastfeeding. So if people are separated from their baby, if the baby's given formula early, if they don't have skin to skin, if all the relations come over and start passing the baby around, then it might miss the feeding cues, and that could have a physical effect on the person's kind of milk supply as well. So physically can't breastfeed. There's different kind of two sides to that, really. And sometimes the circumstances can cause a physical reason. Not that it can't be overcome, it can, but just to kind of be aware that this can be a reason. So yes, so the UNICEF Baby Friendly Initiative, that was put in place, and it's an accreditation process for hospital and community settings. It started in 1994, and the idea was to help improve breastfeeding rates in the UK, because UNICEF's a worldwide charity, isn't it, helping children, and they were thinking often, you will see appeals for UNICEF in other countries, providing aid to countries and places in need, and also like supporting vaccination and those kind of health interventions which make a big difference. UNICEF thought to themselves, what can we do? What's the main issue in the UK that's going to help babies and children the most? And they decided that was supporting breastfeeding, because it's going to make a massive difference. So that was put in place, so health organisations can sign up to that to make sure that breastfeeding is supported in an evidence-based and effective way. And this does make a difference and does help kind of raise breastfeeding rates, and help make sure that people get those consistent and reliable messaging and information and support. Locally, we've got Southend Sports Breastfeeding, which is to help local organisations and businesses and groups be supportive towards breastfeeding, and make sure that women know that they're welcome there. UK law already supports breastfeeding anywhere, out and about. You're allowed to breastfeed anywhere you are legally allowed to be, so you're not allowed to break into somebody's living room and breastfeed there. But anywhere you're legally allowed to be, you are allowed to breastfeed. So the law already supports this. However, it's more about that kind of people feeling welcome and knowing that shop will support them, and feeling that they're able to breastfeed there, that shop or organisation or venue. Yeah, do look out for that. And then finally, kind of coming to back to Bump to Breast, the ethos behind that has been to create, or help to create, that supportive breastfeeding community. And people will talk about, breastfeeding means something holistic. Breastfeeding, being something shared, that journey that you're sharing together with others, that you're meeting other people who've been there too. You're kind of building those connections. People don't always have that extended family around them. Maybe grandparents are in another country. Maybe the other thing is, when we're working in areas with the poorer health outcomes, with the higher levels of deprivation, we know that life expectancy is lower. We know that healthy life expectancy is lower. And you can tell from that, if grandparents are around, they may well be likely themselves to be living with health conditions themselves, so less able to kind of help out in practical ways. So people are less able to have that support. And many parents tell us that they've found their people, they've found their community, and through that kind of building those friendships and networks. That's really, really helped them in their journey, and being able to participate and have a voice as well. We've done quite a lot of creative stuff. Our breastfeeding books, which give people a chance to tell their story, to take photos of themselves out and about in Southend, you know, be proud of that, tell that story. And then if other people then come across those, then hopefully they'll see that in Southend we welcome breastfeeding, that breastfeeding is normal if and that somebody has breastfed there before. So I'm going to leave it there, and be interesting to see if people have got comments or questions or any other breastfeeding myths or anything else interesting that you've come up with.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, Eleanor. One was from Lizzie around the statistic about exclusive breastfeeding and how that's calculated, and how if they just have one emergency bottle feed, then it's discounted.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I'm not actually sure about that. Is, you know, what I think the way to find out, which I might do if I have some spare time, Lizzie, is that, you know, on the actual UNICEF website where that statistic's quoted, you can go through and find all the bits of research that they found everything from, all the original papers, and there is links to that, and it'll be somewhere in there. So I'm not sure, but it's a really interesting point.
And then thanks, Ellen. And then another one we had from Claire. You mentioned a book. I think it was Amy Jones.
Amy Brown. Yeah.
Yep. She was asking for the name of the book.
Yes. So there's one called Informed is Best, which is great. So and there's another one, I can't remember what it's called, but what I can do is look it up and email. I've got several of hers, and I will email you the lists later so that people can have a look at those, because there's a few other things which might be interesting for kind of further reading as well.
Perfect. I'll send that out as a follow-up.
Yeah.
I can see that Elizabeth has got her hand up. Elizabeth?
Hi, Eleanor. Thank you.
Hello.
That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask what you think about the influence of social media on women's choices to breastfeed. So I think about my experience. I had my children sort of 10, 15 years ago, and I remember there was a couple of women in my antenatal class who were adamant that they weren't going to start breastfeeding. And it was mostly because their husbands told them not to, because they would change their body shape. And I know this is one of the myths that you said about dispelling, but I wonder how much women are much more focused on their body and their looks these days because of social media, and whether that's helping to perpetuate these myths.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I've not seen kind of any actual research like one way or another. There may well be some out there. I think from the people that I've come across, sometimes I think all sorts of parenting can sometimes be a bit like idealized on social media, can't it? Whether it is breastfeeding or not breastfeeding. And I think it's kind of, for me, I kind of see people like finding that coming to a physical group with other people there is a real antidote to sometimes seeing those like idealized, unattainable versions of parenting, which actually is not real life and people can't live up to. So, you know, while breastfeeding can look peaceful, can look lovely, having lovely feed, the reality is that it is sometimes hard as well. So I think, yeah, sometimes that's kind of like unattainableness of social media generally can put a lot of pressure on everyone, but especially women and especially parents, because it's kind of setting up this kind of whatever it is. It's like it's almost we can't never live up to that. So why bother, or not why try kind of thing, when actually when we can come together as a community, then we can recognise, well, actually you can't do everything. It's not humanly possible to be everything, do everything, have everything, get everything perfect all the time. We're like perfectly imperfect community kind of thing. Come together and we will support each other and we will get through this. And I think that's where you kind of get that difference between like seeing people, I suppose, more that kind of like influencers or famous people on social media, versus the coming together as a physical community, which can then be supported by those social media interactions, because people will connect with each other on social media, but then when it's supporting that kind of real life supportive lovely friendship through thick and thin, then that's something that's really positive. But sometimes the kind of like idealized versions of parenthood can be, you know, quite kind of destructive and difficult for people to see.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We've got a comment from Maria in the chat there, Eleanor, saying she was told tongue tie would not affect a baby breastfeeding, and that it absolutely made a difference.
Okay, yes. Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Because yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Tongue tie, they can't get their tongue out so far, and you know, tongue ties will affect babies in different ways, but you know, if somebody's finding it is affecting breastfeeding, then it is. And I think this is sometimes, you know, people are like sometimes feel that they're kind of seen, like the paperwork of them is seen rather than the actual person. And I wonder if, you know, sometimes that's what she was feeling was going on a little bit, because you know, a thing can be described as something on paper, but when you actually look at the person, look at the mum, look at the baby and see what's going on, then you kind of get a much fuller picture of what's going on. Yeah, tongue tie can affect breastfeeding, and it's just, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, you know, sometimes tongue tie doesn't affect breastfeeding, but you know, certainly can do.
Brilliant, thank you. Beverly.
I just wanted to know how it's best to get our families in touch with yourselves, or are there flyers? Have you got leaflets? I don't know if the libraries have got, but yeah, just wanted to know how we can sort of signpost them to your service.
Yes, I have got leaflets. My list for actually today is to get some more printed, because I know Southend Food Bank wants some as well, and I'm sure Julie could probably do with some of the hospitals. So if you'd like some, where shall I get, Beverly? Where shall I get them to?
Could you? I don't know which is your local library, but anywhere, one of the libraries, if you could just put them to my name or book start on them.
All right.
And whatever your local library, are you in Southend?
We are,
local?
yeah. I'll drop them into the forum.
The forum's perfect, and then we'll pick them up from there.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
That'll be great. Thank you. We can share them with our families. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. And the library network has signed up to Southend Supports Breastfeeding as well, so you'll be featured on the map as a welcoming space. Yeah. Great. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions or comments? I can't see any in the chat, but we'll come to the room. Oh, sorry, I've just seen there is a comment from Kirsty there in the chat, who says, absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Eleanor. I found statistics you gave at the start very interesting. Could we have them sent to us, please?
Yeah, I'll give you the link, Roger, and then along with those other kind of further reading books, and then yeah, if you want to send those out, that'd be amazing.
Brilliant. Okay. If there isn't anything else from anybody, thank you so much for that, Eleanor. It was really interesting topic and discussion. We'll do a follow-up afterwards with a recording of the session. But I'll hand over to you, Eleanor, just to do a final close.
Oh, well, yeah, well, thank you all for coming. It's been really, really lovely to share with you all, and thanks for everybody's comments. That was wonderful. And we'll look forward to some more Lunch and Learn, because I know there's some more coming up.